So, Nick, before we go too far, I wanted to give you a fun little update that I thought you would be particularly equipped to appreciate.
I'm excited about this. So rarely do fun little updates pertain to me.
A few weeks back, we had a whole conversation about my love of musicals and how I'm probably in the closet. And
What? Hey, wait, I don't think we went that. I think there's a strong overlap between musicals and perceived homosexuality. And Kyle, if you want to bang dudes, you go right ahead. But I don't think there was any closet talk.
I know, it was a joke. So the one I recommended is still the one I would recommend for starting out. Well, not even for starting out, but I recommended a musical. There's another famous musical that's making waves right now. It's called Cabaret. And so Cabaret is nobody's idea of a good time for a first musical. It is a great one. It's an all-time classic. But very, weird and dark as a show. Surprisingly, it's the guys who wrote it are the same guys who wrote Chicago, which is, a much more fun and lighthearted one, even though it's technically about committing not premeditated, but which one's, is it First Degree where you shoot someone when it's not premeditated, or is it Third Degree?
So First Degree is most severe, and that is premeditated.
Okay, so it's about someone committing third-degree murder and then lying to get away with it, and they get away with it because they're pretty and they have a good lawyer. So maybe that is dark, but it's dark in sort of a fun way. Cabaret is not like that. Cabaret is about it's highly adapted, fictionalized version of this dude's story who was probably lying when he wrote the journal anyway, but it's about this dude who goes to a little place called Berlin in a time period in the late 20s, early 30s. And, he gets really into the Berlin nightlife scene and going to the nightclubs and hanging out with all of the people there. And, at first it's all just fun and games and, scantily clad ladies and, late night hookups and things. But, this other ominous energy just begins seeping through the cracks as history progresses, as it were. So you're just, you're the final, the show doesn't even really have a definitive ending so much as it has, basically it ends with a hate crime and all of the characters going, well, that was fucked up, but it's probably a one-off, right? Back to singing. And that's the end of the show.
That sounds like a weird thing to walk out of, to be like, wow, that was an excellent production, but now I just have to go and sit and think for a while.
Yes, it goes back to my thing that musicals used to be a legitimate intellectual medium and still can be in some cases, but not as it's more rare to think of them that way now. But anyway, so the show doesn't has a couple of different contenders for main character, but everybody agrees that the most fun male role is the guy who runs. He's the MC of the titular cabaret. So he's this weird little, almost certainly gay man, but not necessarily, but you can't prove it, who gets up on stage and in between the girls doing their numbers, he sings funny songs and does little dances. And every night he introduces the whole show trilingually, which is why I know how to say, Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome, friender, étranger, stranger. So yeah, so it's a great role played by many a luminary from Joel Grey to Alan Cumming, and it was a big I wouldn't say it was a controversy, the casting originally, but this newest production is a little bit controversial for its whole take because it's a little bit more it just takes an even darker view of a dark show, which is basically the idea that all of the people in the show are kind of down for the slow creep of fascism. In earlier versions, it's something that's happening to them. And in this version, the way it's staged, it's kind of implied that they don't talk about it, but they're sort of on board too with it. And so it's that's made some people upset about the show. I don't have a strong opinion about the text one way or another, whether that's a corrupted thing. The strongest opinion I had about it is the original MC for this production was Eddie Redmayne doing his Eddie Redmayne thing. And people were like, it's too much Eddie Redmayne. And I get that. But his contract ended. And this was I went all this way around to get to the new MC playing the show, wearing a mask for the entire performance, although it's just a domino mask. The new casting is Orville Peck is going to be the Broadway star of Cabaret.
So before we get any further, I feel like I do need to butt in and say that, hey, you're listening to our bonus content. I'm not even sure yet what we're about to get balls deep into as Kyle steers us towards that goal. But Orville Peck, you say, as the what was his name? The what's his position? You just described.
He's the MC, the master
MC,
of ceremonies. You know how, like, when you go and do comedy, there's a guy whose job it is to introduce all the acts.
Well,
and
I kept
tell a little joke in between each set. He's that guy.
I kept thinking of a dumber term, though. I was like, is he the concierge? That doesn't sound right, but yes, okay, the MC. And so is this good or bad? I think it sounds cool, but very strange.
No, I just thought you would be interested in the fact that, you're the person who introduced me to Orville Peck. And I was like, yeah, he's cool. I mean, and if you told me that, like, a guy who's, like, entire persona was also really into musical theater, I would absolutely be like, oh yeah, of course. But I didn't see it coming. And so when they were like Orville Peck is going to play this silly German nightclub host who may or may not be secretly fascist, I was like, well, I would never have predicted that, but I bet he can pull that off. I would pay money to see that.
Yeah, well, and for anyone who's never heard of this fellow, Orville Peck is I'm not even sure musically how to describe him, because I want to say he's like a country singer, but he's not really been embraced by the larger country music community.
Gee, I can't imagine why.
Well, and I think, like, hey, first of all, yeah, he's very, I say openly gay. I don't even know if, like, that's the right term. A gay fellow who sings country music while wearing, like, a Lone Rider, I guess, yeah, like, domino mask the entire time. And the only reason I'm hesitant to say it's country music is because it is so, like, croony. And I don't say that in, like, a negative way. I think it's great. But, yeah, I don't know. It's weird to not just be able to say he's straight up country when I feel like that's probably the most accurate description.
I think he's probably some, like, subgenre of country music that neither of us is, like, in enough to, like, identify. But yeah, I would definitely classify, if the question is he more a country singer or more a pop singer or a rock singer? He's obviously more a country singer than either of the other two.
Very much so. Well, and so are we talking about how great he is, or what do we do?
I just want you to know, maybe you can look him up on YouTube doing a little bit of his thing. I'm sure they're going to record it. No,
I think it's great. I'm happy to know. I just didn't know what the next step is now that I do know. But thank you for telling me.
That was it. To me, he's your special little guy. I don't know if that's fair. I have a lot of people, like, basically for everyone I meet, every time they introduce me to a new singer, I just file away, like, that singer belongs to that person in my head. And so Orville Peck is your special little guy, you know.
I'm happy that my special little guy is really, like, breaking out and taking over. Is this on Broadway, or is this like a smaller production?
No, this is like a major Broadway production.
I assume that's what you meant. It is still very strange.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around, right?
It really is. Like, that's great. I'm happy he's doing that. But I think just same as you, like, did not see that coming at all. So, hey, good for you, Orville. Whatever your real name is.
All right. So anyway, moving right along, do you have any updates for me about anything we've discussed in the past?
Oh, Lord, no. I think the only thing is that I have been playing a lot more Street Fighter, trying to build up my basic skills so I can make some ground online. Still being very afraid, still being very sheepish, but feel like I am slowly but surely improving. So watch out. Online Street Fighter players. I'll put my gamer tag or whatever the hell out there, and then you can all bully me online. So that's it.
Cool. So I apologize to Nick before he doesn't know, because part of our format is we don't necessarily tell the other person what we're going to talk about. We can. It's just more fun if we don't. And so I didn't tell Nick what we were going to discuss, but I did apologize in advance. Because I have this concern that this entire conversation is just going to be me slowly disappearing up my own ass. So hopefully that does not happen. If anyone can save me from it, it will be you, Nick, but we'll see.
I was going to say, like, that sounds like a cool trick. I have no interest in stopping that, but let's go.
So today on our show, which is a spinoff of the show where we talk about the silly science guys and how their broad-based popular hijinks are not actually that funny or interesting, but we're not elitist or shitty people. I would like to do a little detour and just talk about philosophy.
Okay.
As a concept, as a thing that I think more people should explore and try. Particularly, again, I think if I have a sort of a manifesto in general, it is that this thing that is associated with a particular and annoying group of people should not be defined by the group of people who annoy you, who are really into it. And instead, you should just come at the thing yourself. So that was true about musical theater. It's true about nerdy shit in general. And I think it's just as true of philosophy. So Nick, who's the most annoying person you've ever met who was really into philosophy?
Oh boy. This is difficult because I'm someone who, dabbles but enjoys philosophy, and I'm scared to ever bring it up because I worry that by doing so, I'm trying to, announce to everyone around me that, look at me, I'm a smart guy who likes smart guy things. And so, Kyle, it's gotta be you, buddy.
Yeah, I'll take that L. So here I think is most people's exposure. If they ever encounter philosophy in their life, it is in one of two contexts. Either they go to college, and maybe they take a 101 course because they're I'm sorry, I should say this is how most people who are not the people I'm about to make fun of encounter philosophy. So most people, maybe they take a 101 philosophy class and they're kind of interested in it, or maybe they're thinking about it, but then they end up on the quad with some dude who carries around a book by a philosopher. It doesn't even matter which book, but they have made that book their whole identity, and they want to sit and talk to you about how random philosopher from the 1400s, 1500s, 1700s, Kant, Hegel, if it's Nietzsche, God help you, how they are really the guy who explains everything that's going on in life. And then they just start sitting and telling you the meaning of life that they have encountered after reading a book for the first time 2 hours ago. And that, I think, leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. And it's where we get this sort of negative idea that all people who are into philosophy are kind of insufferable, pretentious dickheads. Does that sound right to you?
I like to think that kind of guy doesn't actually exist and is only a stereotype, but he's got to be out there somewhere. Someone's got to be annoyed by the dickhead. So it does sound right to me.
I mean, to be fair, how do I want to put this? I think if you're a woman, you encounter them more often on a college campus. Let's put it like that, because it's a weird form of flirting. Bearing your red breast as a bird is bearing, explaining the Communist Manifesto to other people, which is actually a good segue, because probably to a lot of people, it's like the Communist Manifesto, that's not philosophy. Spoiler alert, the Communist Manifesto is definitely philosophy, which is sort of like everything, one of the points I want to hit upon today is basically almost all politics and ideology is downstream of philosophy in one way or another.
Are you sure that manifesto isn't just some sort of rag written by the devil to trick us into buying less American goods?
Yes, it was actually, who's that guy, the billionaire who's constantly paying protesters on the left? What's his name?
Oh, you mean Peter Thiel, maybe, or?
No, he's on the right. Who's the?
Oh, on the left. Sorry. Ooh, I don't know who that is on the left, actually.
George Soros. I was reminded. So George Soros in a time machine invented the Communist Manifesto. Is a sentence that I feel like you will hear from. You could unironically hear on a podcast.
I feel like you should trust him more than anything if he's figured out access to a time machine. Come on, let him have that win and just follow his lead. But anyway.
That's fair. Anyway, the other way, so similar to the college campus thing, but even more annoying is maybe you'll go online and you'll be like, this happens, I think, less rarely, or this happens much more rarely now because we're all more in our bubbles. But in the early 2000s, or, you know, you could go on the message boards or even on Facebook or Reddit or whatever, and you would be typing up your opinion about something, and then someone would like pop in with a long quote from some philosopher or other that they sort of thought would settle the argument definitively. And that would get really annoying too. As someone who's definitely has done that, then, you know, I don't have a leg to stand on. But philosophy. Go ahead.
I was going to say but, you know, through your own trials and tribulations, you know what it's like to once walk that dark path and to admit that you too have grown from that and understand the vileness and that there is redemption.
It's true. It's true. These days, I don't generally, you know, I think an interesting thing to know about me generally is that I have no claim to being any kind of real philosophy is a deep academic pursuit now. You know, it's been highly academized. I don't even know what the right word is, but basically it's discipline that you go to school for. And then the only people who really practice it seriously for the most part are people who are teaching philosophy classes and writing papers for philosophy publications and stuff like that. So outside of like people with PhDs writing, you know, incredibly niche analyses to each other, philosophy doesn't have a lot of practical application to most people's lives, which is why, you know, you never hear anyone describe themselves as a philosopher, and I would feel self-conscious describing myself as a philosopher. But if the definition of philosophy is someone who thinks about all the philosophical works that they have read, all of the philosophers who have influenced them, and you know, generally kind of tries to look at things through a philosophical mindset as best as possible whenever they can, then in that sense, you know, I am one of those people. And I have been probably my whole life, but definitely, you know, for a little background about me, I went to a school that was created for the express purpose of, it didn't have a particular, it definitely probably had some kind of political bent, but insofar as it had like a mission statement, it was less about we're going to churn out people of a particular ideological framework, and it was more about we want people to understand all of like the intellectual frameworks and arguments that shaped the world we live in today. So very naively, they were creating things in like the early 20th century, and they were seeing what was going on, and they were like, you know, it seems like everything that happens to us is downstream of these arguments that philosophers and statesmen and mathematicians and scientists have been, you know, exchanging this whole huge like conversation and debate they've been having with each other for thousands and thousands of years. It's really hard to know what's going on or how to think about things if you're unfamiliar with that context. So we're just going to try to give it to anyone who wants to come hang out with us for 4 years. That was literally the mission statement, was come, read a bunch of works. Some of them were directly philosophy. Some of them were science and mathematics that were influenced sort of by the same kind of intellectual framework and pursuits as influenced philosophers. Some of it was just literature, but it's all the same thing. Again, part of like, depending on how you look at it, you can either say that philosophy is downstream of art or art is downstream of philosophy, but there's basically, you know, there's a cultural zeitgeist and there's the people who think about it, and the way that they think about things sort of slowly emanates outwards and creates sort of the vibe that everybody else has to live in. I don't actually know if that's true anymore, but I guess my argument is that it should be, that if there's anything that's really fucked up right now, in our post-truth, everybody yelling at each other, nobody, you know, I think what people think is wrong with like the world right now is that nobody has the same set of facts, but that's a real, you know, that's a hard thing to know how to deal with. I think what's wrong with people is nobody has the same framework for how we resolve. Like, nobody even thinks about under what framework should we actually adjudicate arguments and facts and anything else. What are our first principles? So that is the thing that I want to go back to about why philosophy is good, if it's good. And I think it's good.
I will tell you right now that my primary interest in philosophy is to be all walking, talking modern Socrates, which is whenever other two people are having an argument, I ask them a bunch of questions until they think I might know the answer, and then I get the fuck out of there. And that's been helping out, but I'm interested in your more practical application as to the world's issues here.
Well, no, that's a good. So let's go all the way back. So you mentioned Socrates. So Socrates, as our audience may or may not be familiar with, was a Athenian, meaning the city-state of Athens prior to the modern nation-state of Greece. He was a citizen of the city-state of Athens, I think 500 to 600 BC, somewhere in that range. I could be a little off by 100 years, give or take. But
God so help you if you are.
But anyway, he lived during a time when Athens was a lot like, I'm not the first person to use this metaphor, was a lot like the United States is now. They had won, a very big war, and they were considered sort of heroes for like the way in which they had coordinated the resistance against Persia. And they responded to that by being like, well, that's great and all. You respecting us is great, but it would even be cooler if you let us be the imperial linchpin of Greece, and you all gave us a bunch of money and soft power that we could use, to extort you and grow our wealth and influence across all of Greece and then maybe even the world. And so that was, Athens during the time Socrates lived in, and his basic bit,
his shtick.
Yeah, his shtick was that he would supposedly, we don't have that many firsthand accounts. Well, I guess that's not true. What I want to say is the people who most famously write about Socrates, mix in a lot of their own philosophy with they basically make their arguments come out of Socrates' mouth. That being said, a lot of the time, nobody disputes that, yes, what they're writing, it does seem to be like what it was like talking to Socrates. It's just not clear what his actual philosophy was. So when I talk about the philosophy of Socrates, I'm really talking about, sort of his philosophical approach as delineated by people who were writing about him afterwards. But that they all sort of agreed that he was a certain type of guy. And as Nick said, he was a certain type of guy who, instead of having, as far as we can tell, any real job, would go around in the public marketplace and ask people questions about, what they thought about anything, really. Life, the universe, everything, what they knew, literally on any topic. And he would sort of bring it back around, sort of their implicit assumptions about the nature of whatever they were talking about. And then he'd be like, and let's go a step deeper on that. And he would ask, questions and questions. And so he was compared, in one text that I've read, Socrates gets compared to something called a torpedo fish, which is kind of, I think, like an electric eel. Basically, it's something you touch it and you go numb because you lose all feeling in your hands. Oh. And so they were like, talking to Socrates is kind of like the intellectual equivalent of like handling a torpedo fish, because you would start talking to him and you'd be very confident. And then just the longer that you'd talk to him, the more you'd be like, I don't know anything. And that was sort of his whole, that was ostensibly his whole, gig, was just helping people understand that they didn't know as much as they thought about anything. And he famously said, the only thing that I know is that I know nothing, which has since then become kind of a joke. Come on, Socrates. I know things. I can teach you some things if you want to know things. This is a tree.
He's not having it.
Yeah.
He's got a reputation to stand on.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this whole approach is it sounds pretty harmless, but in conjunction with the kind of people he associated with and the kind of people who were most interested in hanging out with them, several of those people went on to be politically prominent, and it sort of placed them at the center of a lot of controversies in Athens, which ended with him being put on trial for heresy or blasphemy. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is, but basically he was accused of being, sort of an atheist who didn't believe in God, which was actually a crime they could kill you for, and found guilty. And my favorite, one of my favorite facts about him is when they're like, for a guy who didn't know anything, when they're like, do you want to, it's like, we find you guilty of this. Do you want to like throw yourself on the mercy of the court? He's like, nah, I'm good. I'm pretty sure you're wrong. It's fine. He's like, it's going to look so much worse for you when you're the dude who killed me than anything. He's like, I think if you really wanted to do what was just, you'd just give me free meals for life. So if you're not going to give me free meals for life, then you might as well just kill me.
Baller to the end.
Baller to the end. And so we start out this little aside by being like, well, that was a fun and interesting thing to do, but what is your practical approach? Like, what does this have to do with anything practical? And that's actually a big recurring theme in like the Platonic dialogues, which again are sort of an attempt to capture some of the energy of these early Socratic discussions that he was a part of, which is that when you are talking to people about what it is that they think on the deepest level, inevitably you are going to hit upon the ways in which those things shape their politics and their ideas of like who should be in charge of a city or a country. What is fair? What does justice look like? These are things that we all sort of have implicit definition. Well, we all think that if we drill down, like when we say something is unfair, we all think that if we drill down, if someone asked us, why is that thing unfair? That we could give like a cogent answer. We could be like, well, this is what it means for something to be unfair. This is how that relates to that. And actually, what Socrates was one of the first people to point out is most people can't do that. In fact, it might not even be that most people can't do it because they like don't think enough about it. It's actually the case that the world is very complicated and hard. Language is hard. Lots of ideas are socially mediated and constructed. So whenever you try to talk about anything, you inevitably are going to reach a point where something that you thought you understood 100% has some inherent contradictions inside of it. And when that happens, you basically have two choices. You can choose to sort of like double down, knowing that you're wrong, and just assume that, maybe even if I'm wrong, I can sort of force my definition to make sense in the long run just through sheer application of power. Mm-hmm. Or, you can kind of go back to the drawing board. You can be like, well, that made sense for where I was at that time when I arrived at those thoughts. But having looked at it further, maybe I need to reevaluate things. So it's an inherently, as Plato shows, it's an inherently political project. You can't really talk about anything. You can't even talk about, how do you know the best way? If you're going to talk about what's the best way to like, catch a fish, then if you're going to talk about that, eventually, if you get deep enough on it, you can say what has the best results. But if you want to talk about why is it the best way to catch a fish, and you don't want to just go back to, well, it's the one that gets me the most fish, then you have to get into like, what does it mean for something to be the best way to do something? What is the best? How do we know what best means? Is there is being the best at something different in different situations, or is it the same in every situation? Who's the best person to be president of the United States? And so you go from fishing to, the universe.
I have a joke. I think this very much about this process, and it specifically uses an example of how obnoxious I was after I graduated law school, which is still hanging out with my same old regular nerd friends, and one of them putting forth jokingly, I assume, hey, what do you think is the best thing about a spacesuit? The answer being, you can poop in one. To which I then must break down what it is to mean what is best in a spacesuit. What are we judging it by? What are the qualities? Tell me what that means. Tell me whether it's important to an astronaut or the common man. And most importantly of all, show me a suit I can't poop in.
I love that. Yeah, so you would have made a great, I think you would have made a great, I think you are kind of a modern day philosopher, Nick, but I think you would have done very
that's what
well.
I keep telling everybody.
And, there's this idea, right, that the only modern day philosophers are real who speak to like common people in words that they understand, or like stand-up comedians. And on the one hand, I do think that there's something true about that, which is that comedians tend to be the people who like to challenge people's a good joke is a joke which begins with the audience's assumption. Well, maybe a good joke is anything that gets a laugh. But, one way to reliably get laughs is to start with the audience's assumption of where you're going and then subvert that, which means you are inherently playing with like the definitions and constructs in your audience's head, as like the, pooping in the astronaut suit joke sort of displays.
I think excellently. A textbook example, if I dare say so.
Yeah. But it creates the problem with that, of course, is that we have, unfortunately, in giving, like, basically comedians are the only people who have license to do that, we've sort of lost something, which is this, it's not clear that this was intent. This is another argument that goes all the way back. You can find them having it in Plato, which is like, shouldn't this be something that anyone can do and that anyone should be encouraged to do? Why is it something that we only give people in that we only engage in very specific contexts and times? And we generally like, why is so much of modern discourse listening to someone else pretend to do philosophy? Why don't we just do it ourselves whenever we're sitting around?
Well, so just, I don't know if this is where you're going with this, but I think I have to chime in because this what you're describing makes me think of like, I don't know, especially after law school, but like not like it never happened before then, but arguing with somebody and presenting something that seems like pretty obvious or clear, and they're like, oh, you just know how to argue, you know how to blah blah blah, and having like this frustration motive of wanting to push back, and it's like, no, I know how to like think and ask questions about things that you've just never even bothered to like stop and consider.
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
being frustrating, and like a real lack. I don't know. It feels like my whole youth, people were talking about a lack of critical thinking skills in like the general community. And I was always like, oh, that's the thing old people say because they don't like anyone who disagrees with them. And now that I'm an old man, I feel like there's a lack of general critical thinking skills in the community.
No, absolutely. And again, not to, I don't think Socrates is a perfect, I don't know anything about the guy other than, the way he's portrayed. So, and he's portrayed as sort of like deliberately kind of saint-like, but funny at the same time. So it's a hard representation to beat.
Sure.
But I don't mean to make it seem like I think we should all try to be that guy. But it is funny because that is a thing that he was constantly being accused. So at the time, again, this is why you can see how sort of democracy and philosophy are inherently connected to each other in a weird way. Because at the time Socrates was practicing this, there was this other group of people called sophists.
Ah, yes.
Sophist is in the word sophisticated, which means like wise. Sophos means wise in ancient Greek. And their whole thing was exactly what you were accused of, which is that like they knew that audiences were easily confused and easily swayed by their emotions. And so sort of the specialty of the sophist was basically that they could make any argument seem like a good argument. That's literally how it's presented. It's like they make a bad argument seem like a good argument, a weak argument seem like a strong argument. And they do that because they use all of these highly technical and sophisticated argumentation skills. And they also, know how to work the crowd. I think the best modern example, and lawyers, I think, are often accused generally of being sort of modern sophists, and probably some of them are.
I think that is absolutely correct. It's as you started getting into sophistry, I was like, yeah, this is lawyers all the way. This is what trials are. This is all of it.
Yeah, and I think the best modern parody of a sophist is probably, I'm sure you've seen it, but I don't know if you remember it, but there's a bit in South Park. I can't even remember who's on trial, but Johnny Cochran comes to defend someone, and he gives what is known as the Endor defense, and he just starts talking. He's like, it's funny because On Kashyyyk, they have Wookiees, but then on Endor, they have Ewoks. And what really is the difference between a Wookiee and an Ewok, except for size? And so if you really think, and like over the course of that little like rambling monologue, he somehow convinces everyone to be on his side.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, but he didn't actually say anything about the facts of the case. And that was sort of the idea of like how a sophist worked. And so interestingly, this is, I don't know if this is true. This is something, that again isn't Plato, but I don't know if this is actually the origin of the term. It might have, come earlier, but in Plato's account of things, the reason we have the word philosophy is because Socrates is constantly accused of being a sophist. And he's like, no, I'm nothing like those guys. I'm doing something different. And he creates the term philosopher, friend of wisdom, as someone who is distinct from a sophist. So you notice they have the same root in there, that sophism is in both, but has a different relationship to it than the sophists because he wants to be thought of as doing a different thing. And I think it is. I think the thing that Socrates is doing, and I think this is, I don't know if this is the root of, if I was thinking before this podcast, if I had to come up with like a single, definition of philosophy, probably that's something that, is sort of a fool's errand. But if I were going to try, it would be this idea that everything has to eventually be taken back to first principles. First principles, also called axioms. So it's basically the idea, how do we go back as far as we can in our own framework of, when we're making an argument, if we're going to be critical about it, how do we go all the way back and find like the most basic assumptions we may have made in that argument? Where they founded on? And what are the things that are in our heads that are so basic and obvious that they're really difficult to even argue with? And then how do we rebuild arguments from there into something that makes more sense? Does that make sense to you, Nick?
Yes. Sorry. I wasn't sure if you were waiting for like feedback there or not, but yes. Also, I don't know, as we're going through this, I'm thinking about my wacky, like I said, I've only dabbled in philosophy and thinking about particularly I had a professor at Montana Tech, primarily a mining school, didn't want liberal arts, and our professor teaching us, gosh, I want to say it was like an object permanence thing. Maybe it was really more of like the world not existing save for when someone perceives it, and going outside of the classroom to just stare at all of us and say, oh, look at you, you exist, closing the door, opening it again, going, ah ha ha, you didn't exist there for a while, did you? I knew you were up to it. Those being my practical lessons in this, and not nearly as sophisticated. But I'm glad that we're talking about the sophists being shitheads, so I'm on board still.
Yeah, and I mean, it does. So that's where philosophy gets, its edge as a more abstract and metaphysical sort of pursuit, because that is part of it, right? Is once you start questioning everything, you start questioning the basic things like, what is it to perceive? How is the universe put together such that I can, make logical arguments? Like, how is it that the words that come out of my mouth are understood in some sense in your brain when they enter them, to the extent that they are? That's kind of weird when you think about it. How does that work? So that's without, because I'll admit, I personally am much more interested in like ancient philosophy, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and those guys than modern philosophy. But you get it on both ends, and it's kind of funny in both places. So the many people say that I was taught that sort of the first modern philosopher was probably Descartes. And Descartes is, he breaks with the tradition mostly because he stops thinking of philosophy as sort of a communal activity that you engage in mostly with other people, and something that you can do as a singular meditative activity. I may have, again, there's people with PhDs in this stuff who will never listen to this, so I shouldn't worry about it, but who might take issue with that. But that's just how I think about it. But famously, his thing is he goes into a cabin in the woods and he's like, what if nothing that, is I'm seeing or observing is actually real? What if it's all being fed into my head by some kind of like evil or malicious spirit? and nothing and no one exists except for me. Where do I go from there? And he goes, well, I think I have a strong sense of myself. I think, therefore I am. So if I am, then, how do I get from there to everyone else? And then he makes a bunch of arguments that many people feel are not at all particularly persuasive from a philosophical standpoint. But it's an important exercise, and it sort of demonstrates, the way in which you can do philosophy as an individual, and how that sort of spirit can take hold of anyone, which is just, basically what I'm begging people to do is whenever you feel certain about something, just ask yourself why. If you're in an internet argument or a comment section and you start feeling yourself getting really heated, instead of typing something into your keyboard, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, why not stop and be like, what's going on here? Where are my own thoughts coming from? Who is the person sitting in this chair, and what has led them to this moment where they are having these thoughts? What goes on here? And as you said, Nick, it cultivates a real strength of critical thinking, which allows you both to understand other people better and to sort of, if you want to be a dick about it, you can start seeing the flaws in other people's arguments where they made greater assumptions. But theoretically, as a tool, it's supposed to help you connect with people, right? Because that, again, going back to Socrates, his plan was not to prove that he was smarter than everyone else, although he was literally put to death sort of on the assumption that he thought that. But the goal is just to sort of reach across these arbitrary barriers that we erect and have a real conversation about what we can agree on, and then work backwards from that to see if we can get ourselves to agree on more things over time. And that is, I think, sort of, again, what has been lost is this idea that you can come to agreement with people. And I know it's like, I'm not saying like it's easy. It's actually, I think, one of the hardest things in the world. I think we started off with agree to disagree, and then we went to basically only talk to people who already agree with you. And I am basically begging us to, as painful and annoying as it is, to try to find the third thing, which is talk to people who disagree with you. And when you find disagreement, the perfectly natural response is to say, well, we're not going to get any further here. But I think there is value, and I think there is value in saying, oh, we disagree with each other here. Let's look at why. Let's try to work this out, and let's be honest and humble, and, admit what we don't know and try to figure out on what steps we can agree to resolve what we don't know. And let's just, take it one step at a time. And if you're like, well, that sounds really hard, I don't know how to do that, I have good news, because there does exist about 2,400 years worth of writing of different people attempting this exercise in different ways. And a lot of them are really arrogant, really kind of douchey. They say things that sound absolutely crazy, and in many times have just been proven empirically false. But the overall attitude of just coming at things and trying to build an argument from scratch that reaches other people and is not, just a concealed set of emotional manipulations is, it's a proud tradition. And, I think we need to embrace more of it.
Now, because this is a spin-off of the Big Bang Theory, I feel like I nonetheless need to start delving into some basic psychoanalysis here. Were you in some sort of recent mind battle with an irrational idiot? And this is like a long-term passive-aggressive way to hope they listen to this podcast and stop and think, hey, when me get mad without reason and yell, that bad, me should think more. Because...
No,
Go ahead.
I'm going to tell you something. First off, yes, I get into arguments all the time with not generally in person, because I don't talk to many but I am absolutely like an old school, like clacking on my keyboard with people until 2 a.m. in the morning about things kind of guy. That is just who I am.
That's I have the instinct that I am also trying to suppress, but I very much understand that urge.
Well, I went through a period where I had suppressed it because I recognized that it was becoming a little unhealthy the way I was coming at it. But then, this funny thing happened where we elected a fascist for president. Mm-hmm. And I was like, the weirdest, I can't explain it, but I feel some personal responsibility for that. Not a lot, because I voted for the other person. But I do feel like my inability to talk to people is just, it's not causative in any way, but it's just endemic. It's symptomatic of the larger disease, which I do feel like the disease is we are just not talking to each other. And I don't think that any conversation I'm having online is actually going to be the thing that's going to fix that. But I want to embody that virtue because I think we should all have it.
Well, you're just reminding me of something that I guess it's been probably at least a month now when I recommended the Kurzgesagt YouTube series, which are these like little edutainment things, but something they talk about in and I can't remember if it was like whether the world was getting worse or like more dangerous or whatever, but just this idea of how we kind of, and it's an idea, I don't know if there's like proof to back this up, that what you're saying is right, because through the internet and having unfettered access to all of the rest of humanity and their opinions and their cultural norms and whatever, that our little brains, which fear even a tribe 2 towns away, just cannot fucking deal with the amount of variance in opinion and the idea that like, oh, well, we couldn't all possibly be right in some way. All these other people must be freaks, right? And how it's taking a while to catch up from basically having too much access to people and their opinions over social media.
Yeah, and I do, again, so not to sound like a broken record, but I do think that the cure for that, I do think philosophy can stand just having a philosophical mindset, by which I mean, again, being willing to humbly listen to what other people think, can actually be a counter to tribalism in that way. I mean, you have to be careful about it because I think this is the thing, and I've actually encountered this like firsthand, which is there are people who will take advantage. It's a weird sort of very niche meta problem, but there are people who will take advantage of your willingness to listen to them, to try to change your mind while they have no interest in changing their own mind or having their own conversation. Like they're like double agents essentially. They're trying to turn you into an asset, and they're using the fact that you are there to, have a conversation in good faith to basically try to creep around and see where your uncertainties and weaknesses are, while they are just playing it very close to the vest, oftentimes because they're secretly like actual Nazis. So you have to watch out for stuff like that.
Yeah, well, and I mention it all the time. It's that great television series Peep Show where Mark starts making a pal and they have a love of military history in common, and boy, it turns out that his new friend Daryl doesn't just love World War II era history, but is a straight up Nazi. And having that moment of realization of like, oh, I was being too naive and earnest about why we were talking about why democracy can be problematic.
Yeah, and you will have that moment. So you have to be careful about, you have to keep yourself sort of safe to, but, I don't think I think going into the assumption that most people are like that is kind of, it's pretty rare, even on the internet, that people are like that. And most of the people who are like that, they just post essays. Just read the essay. You don't have to actually have a back and forth conversation with them where they worm inside your head. Just read whatever manifesto they have and be like, well, that's kind of crazy, and then just move on with your life. So in answer to your, I thought it was a very good question. In answer to your question, is this all directed at some particular asshole online? The truth is, yes, but the asshole is me, and it has always been me. I spent a period from 2016 to sort of 2020 screaming at people on the internet about all of the same things liberals were screaming at everyone on the internet for. Take your pick. I did all of them. I was just angry, leftist, feminist, anti-racist guy on the internet. And I don't feel bad for it, espousing those positions, but I do feel bad for basically, anytime someone argued with me online, typing in all caps or calling them, mentally inferior, or implying that they were just fueled by hate.
Sure.
Because, and this was after I had spent years and years reading reading all of these different philosophers and thinking about all of the different ways that intellectual pursuit can lead you and things like that. And it still wasn't strong enough to inoculate me, but I did feel myself growing kind of soul sick. So I quit, and then coming back, I think I'm doing it in a more healthy way now, but by remembering that. And part of remembering it is just remembering that whoever you're having a conversation with is a person just like you, has maybe thought about their own opinion. Maybe they haven't thought about them to the same extent you have, or maybe they have. But, the piece of advice I got, and again, I realize in conjunction with what I've said before, this sounds psychotic. So I guess there are two things. So philosophy is being willing to go back to your first principles. I would say philosophy is also never try to change anyone's mind without being willing to have your own mind changed, which is probably the hardest thing to do. And so I do think most of the time if I'm not great at it, I'm better at it, which is that I generally do not get into arguments with people about things where I'm not willing to be like, this is where I stand. This is my line in the sand. But, maybe I'm wrong. I will back up a long way. About up until the point where it's like, and that's why Jews secretly control the weather, and black people aren't really people. They're some kind of animals that look like people. And I'm like, okay, well, this has been a nice conversation, but you're a wackadoo, and I'm going to move on. But that, again, I don't want to say that never happens, but that happens pretty rarely. Most of the time, people who you're talking to are, if not, are acting in good faith to the extent that they know how. They're not showing off. They're not, putting on a show for their friends. They believe sincerely what they believe. And if they got to a different place, there is value in, retracing the steps together if you can. It's hard though. I know it's hard. If you don't want to do all that, I'm not sure that starting with that is particularly the best place. Start by reading some fucking books, and I don't just mean like books that conform to your modern ideological positions. I mean, again, go back and read some books read Descartes' Meditations, or read God Help You. But if you really want to get into the weeds, you could start with like Kant or Hegel. Although that's going to be hard. Those guys are really difficult to get into without, some serious heavy lifting help. But hell, just get yourself, there's one of the great things about modernity is we have so many resources. Stanford maintains an online encyclopedia of philosophy that's like Wikipedia, but for philosophical arguments and concepts, that is one of the single greatest resources that has ever existed. It's basically like the Library of Alexandria for philosophy, and it's free online. It's not paywalled. Anyone can access it. You can look up anything. Arguments for and against assisted suicide. What is the nature of justice? You can basically type in any particular big idea, and it will produce a bunch of articles about what every great thinker has ever had to say on the subject. So just, drink deep and descend.
Oh, wow. Well, Kyle, I like all this very much. And you're reminding me, too, of how, just by talking about how accessible all this stuff is, that's something where, when I was trying to decide, like, law school or grad school or whatever it might be, and philosophy was on the table, I was like, if I really wanted to pursue this, I guess, if I wanted to take this more seriously, there's no reason I would actually have to go, like, and do it formally in a university. Like, if I want to go the real scholarly route, I guess. But just because, it is all just available in old, easy to find, cheap books most of the time. And then when you're talking about these like online resources too, it's like if it's aside from struggling with the way of like learning how to read it, which is difficult. There's just like no other real access barriers, I guess.
Yeah. So again, so here are some, I guess I think I usually end mine with some fun recommendations. So, I mean, I want to be a little careful because well, I don't know. It's your mileage may vary. And also some of these people are, they're all philosophers. They're problematic people. Philosophers are problematic people. Even the really good one. I mean, the whole, as one more, not even cautionary tale sort of thing.
I mean, you can name literally any philosopher and any problematic behavior, and I'd go, yeah, it's up. They had some weird ideas. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, well, I think I hope I'm not slandering the wrong guy. But there's this guy, Peter Singer, who I really like in that he wrote some incredible defenses of, like, he's a bioethicist, and he wrote these incredibly impassioned, well-reasoned arguments about, eating less meat, understanding that, morality is important and that animals should also have rights and things like that. I think he is also the guy who thinks that you should be able to murder babies that are born with disabilities, not even just abort them, but, if you wait until the kid is born and then it turns out they have these terrible disabilities that are going to make, not even necessarily make their life harder, make your life harder, you should be allowed to euthanize those people.
Sure.
I'm looking it up. It's definitely him. So
he's an enthusiastic eugenicist.
It's not about so I don't want to try to, but my point, it's not about, I mean, I guess, yes, the policy will end in a eugenic policy, but my point is his entire worldview is around how do I prevent the most suffering? And, he embraces that worldview seriously, and he starts off with, well, then maybe if I'm morally opposed to suffering, we should eat less cows. And then somehow he gets from there to, and if I'm morally opposed to suffering, maybe it's okay to kill disabled infants. And, but I don't hate them. And it's, it's just about minimizing the amount of suffering in the world. I want to make it very clear. I am not endorsing this argument. What I am saying is that the guy legitimately believes both things. And I don't think he secretly is just like fueled by hatred and disgust of disabled people. He just he worked his way across the steps of axioms. And sometimes when you follow your axioms, they take you weird places. And so you either have to be willing to go back to the drawing board, or you have to be able to commit to some pretty crazy ideas. Most people, I think, in that position would be like, oh, I took a wrong turn somewhere, and would go back to the drawing board. But, when you're talking about high profile famous philosophers, a lot of them, the reason they're famous is because they don't do that. They end at a crazy fucking place in the road, and then they're just like, nope, this is where I live now.
Mm-hmm. So it's either I redo all this work I did getting here, or I just accept that I have to eat toddlers now, and I'm not doing all that work again, let me tell you.
Yeah, I don't think that but there's this idea, it's a completely different philosophical idea, but there's this philosophical idea called the repugnant conclusion, which is basically this idea that if you believe in utilitarianism, then it makes sense for there to be like, it's better for the world to have like 1 trillion people who live really shitty lives than 100 people who live really happy lives. Nobody likes that answer. It's just something that follows logically from all of the steps of utilitarianism. So that is what happened. That's the whole point of testing out your first principles, is you see what kind of conclusions you come to. Anyway, not recommending Peter Singer. Am recommending, if you want someone who is very accessible and easy to read, it's a little, it's translated, it's a little stilted, but I kept mentioning Plato. And the great thing about Plato is all of his work that has survived takes the form of dialogues, meaning they're basically little plays that take place between different characters. There's not a lot of action beats, nobody, shoots anyone or throws something across the room. Although how awesome would that be? It's entirely just people talking to each other.
If it were Socrates, except like it's what is it, that weird old like Walking Tall, where he just like walks around hitting people with a 2x4 to also help resolve their issues.
Yes. Yeah, that would be hysterical. But it's not like that. So because it's all designed to mimic the ideas of the conversations that people ostensibly really had, it's somewhat easier to follow. And it's a lot easier if you follow it to sort of remember it. So you can still remember, the basic gist of the philosophical arguments that they make, even for a long time afterwards, because it's not like hyper technical. It is still helpful to, have an edition where they have footnotes explaining what the fuck these people are saying. Because sometimes, they're coming from a philosophical framework that's thousands of years old and makes some different assumptions from how you might naturally think about things. But it is, I think it's generally pretty accessible. Aristotle, similarly, much more technical, but basically he writes about everything. So if anything, you want to know what someone's philosophical opinions on, Aristotle's a good place to start. And then the other guy, okay. And then if you want to, I won't go all the way modern, but if you want two more modern guys who are kind of fun, I love Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard also is trying to, write about anxiety and, virtue and things like that from a more modern perspective. He's super Jesus-y, so you have to figure out, but again, in kind of a fun way. So you kind of just have to, it's not clear that his version of religion and Christianity is like any normal person, like that any other person has ever been the type of Christian that Kierkegaard thinks you should be.
You don't hear people.
That way it's very strange.
You don't hear people on the streets talking about how they need to be a knight of faith all the time and like,
no, exactly.
But sorry, that was it. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, good pull. Kierkegaard's whole thing is like, the guy I think is the most impressive in the Bible is the dude who was willing to murder his own kid. Let's look deeply into that. There's that. And then, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is just a fun read. That's the problem, is a lot of his ideas are deeply problematic. I know from anecdote and experience that most of my friends who were women hate Nietzsche because he kind of writes really shitty things about women most of the time. So there's that whole deal. Whatever his deal with was women is at the very least complicated. Although I will say the person who taught me the most about Nietzsche was a woman, so that's helpful. But if you just want to read something, that's really psychedelic and strange, but just like, shows you how powerful and just like, electric philosophy can feel like. Thus Spoke Zarathustra just reads like an acid trip. It's got, weirdos it's got saints living in the woods. It's got like little midgets doing acrobatics. It's all sorts of crazy shit. I think at one point there's like a dragon that comes out of a volcano. It's wild stuff. And, not sure I would advocate any of his philosophy. It is definitely, but there's a reason that like it is the default like intense philosophical thing of like teenage boys, because he basically, he writes philosophy like it's heavy metal. So it makes sense that teenage boys would be into it.
Well, and was he also like, and I'm going to feel silly if I get this totally wrong, but has some shock value as being a God is dead fellow, which if you're...
No, yeah, he's the one who said that. God is.
Well, that's why I was so sheepish, because I was worried I was wrong. But that itself, like, yeah, you can just like write that as a thing to think and consider as he does. But if you're in any way precious about Christianity, you hear that and you're like, "Whoa, holy fucking shit, man!" That's
yeah. And I mean, now it's still kind of shocking. But imagine what it was like when he wrote that in like 1890 or whenever he was writing. It was like a big deal. And again, so that's an interesting example of how like Nietzsche, so like, as it was explained to me by someone who spent their whole life studying this stuff, when Nietzsche says God is dead, he's not necessarily saying like literally God used to be a real person and now he went away. What he's saying is religion is no longer the chief motivating factor of human society and greatness. Like there was a time in our collective history when belief in God produced all of the greatest works of art and culture and motivated people to seek deeper truths in nature. And, you know, monks and saints and crazy desert hermits were all doing these incredible acts of greatness / suffering in pursuit of, you know, a deeper connection to the divine. And that's never coming back. That's basically what my teacher thought he meant by God is dead. We have to find something else to motivate. Every individual now has to find for themselves a deeper relationship, motivating relationship to the world. And as a society, we have to find a deeper, motivating relationship to the world if we don't want to fall into nihilism, which was his big concern, because it's not going to be God.
Yeah, God is, you know what, maybe that's, instead of saying God is dead, he should have said, like, God is over. God is passé. He was too extreme in his language for people to get on board.
No, he was right. I mean, he was right in, say what you will about Nietzsche, but he always swings for the fences.
That's what I will say about Nietzsche. If anyone comes fucking asking, if anyone's trying to talk shit about Nietzsche, that'll be my strong defense of him is like, hey, you know what? You miss every pitch you don't swing at. And Nietzsche didn't fucking let one get past him, all right? Fuck your God, by the way. Well, Kyle.
Yeah, okay, so can I just finish the... I think this is a fun quote to end on. Let me
Please
see if
do.
I can find the... So, just as an example, here's the full quote. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet owned... What was holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? So I gotta admit, when I hear that, I get that's just fucking goosebumps, man.
Well, so that's actually, I wasn't thinking about this before, it just came to mind because of that, which is, I think, like, speaking about, like, Kierkegaard reminded me that, like, that's one where reading Fear, why am I forgetting all of a sudden? Not Fear and Loathing, but, you know, like, struggling
Fear and
with...
Trembling.
Thank you, yes, that's exactly it. That, I looked for, like, an online class, because, like, reading it, I was like, oh, this is just... some sort of like reiterative gibberish that keeps like bouncing around in my head, which to a degree is like intentionally what he's doing, but also, you know, something I need some parsing. But that's the thing that was like most difficult for me as a younger person trying to get into this is like the way that philosophers will either use what seem like pretty regular, inane terms in very specific ways, or they will use common language to invent a term that you need to figure out what they're using on the spot. And so I don't know what the shortcut around to that is, other than just being like, I don't know, open and ready for whatever wackiness comes at you.
I mean, in their defense, you know, when you try to talk about things, eventually you're going to run into something where it's like, I'm not sure we have like a good word for this, right? It's like,
exactly.
It's like the sense of seeing the color blue for the first time. What the fuck do you call that? And we've gotten a lot of good words out of it too. Like, what is that? You know, uncanny. Uncanny is a word that comes from Heidegger, who was actually a Nazi, and fuck him. But, you know, uncanny is a fun idea, you know, and we've gotten a lot of mileage out of it. Where was I going with that? Oh, so it's hard, but also if you ever buy any of this stuff, you know, like get a slightly more technical version of any particular book, it should have footnotes that explain like all of these terms and try to provide some sort of gloss and context for them that is often helpful.
Yeah. I highly recommend that because I don't know. I don't know when exactly it was that, you know, in my undergrad doing my English degree and, you know, being taught how to do criticism and how to critically think and read complicated texts or whatever. Most of that also, when I was a youth, just glanced off my brain. I just was not ready for it. And I don't know what secret, I don't know if it was a development thing or if I just read the right thing that finally contextualized some other stuff, but there was definitely just like a moment where things started revealing themselves to me, Kyle. It all became so much more clear and open, but I also think it was just, exposure and needing to beat some of this into your head and reread it until it starts making sense.
Yeah, and the good news about it is if you read it, it's not going to make sense right away. And I actually don't think you need to, you do need to reread it probably, but you don't need to reread it right away. If you read it, a fun thing to do, and this is how I got to be the way I am. Like, I don't read that much new philosophy. I read the majority of all the philosophy I'm ever going to read in my life, probably, in my late teens, early 20s. And then most of the time as I'm just walking around, I'm like, what the fuck did that guy mean by that anyway? And just trying to figure it out just opens new landscapes in my mind. I wouldn't pretend that I'm accurately getting at what any of those philosophers were actually trying to convey, but it feels like it changes the way I think about the world in helpful ways, just to, be asking some of the same questions.
Yeah. Well, and also you talked about this too, just about engaging with other people and different ideas. And it's come up a few times on the podcast about whether engaging with ideas you disagree with is whether they're going to poison your mind or something. But I think that's and also mentioning that, all these guys can be pretty problematic and, in fact, some Nazis amidst the bunch. But it's engaging with these different or interesting or even awful ideas that I think helps someone really better understand how they feel about their own beliefs and whether those things withstand or, I guess another thing is if you have a belief you take for granted and an awful person can explain why it's correct, you have to be oh no, do I also feel that way anymore now that I realize that the root of this belief is, I don't know, misogyny or something like that, now that I've actually thought about it real hard.
Yeah. I think that's, with that, we don't have to go on a big soapbox, but we're living through a time where I think a lot of ideas that people assumed we all took for granted, like due process, turn out to mean different things to different people, right? And the idea of, who does and does not deserve a fair treatment, what is and is not a crime, things like that. These are all things that it turns out we do not have any common agreement on. And so, or even for that matter, what is democracy? What does it mean to have a system that represents the people? All of this is stuff that we probably should have spent a little bit more time before now talking about the virtues of and why it's important to have a system that functions even when people disagree with each other, as opposed to having a system that allows 51% of people to exploit 49% of people or vice versa. Get started. We got ground to make up.